Hello and welcome to A Spiritual Guide to Politics. I am Liz Philippos, and I'm here to offer an expanded perspective into this moment in our collective political lives so that we come to a deeper awareness of our capacity to transform and transcend the present paradigm as agents of transformation. Each week, I talk with creative leaders about their spiritual understanding of the current political moment, the possibilities for the well-being of our planetary lives, and the life of the planet itself. They inspire us to know that the personal is political and the political is spiritual. There are tremendous possibilities for transformation when we really come to know this. My guest today is Karlyn Crowley. She is the director of the Cassandra Voss Center at St. Norbert College in De Pere, Wisconsin. She's an equity and social justice consultant, and she's also professor of gender studies and English. Crowley consults, writes, and trains on issues of equity and inclusion. She's widely published in academic and popular publications, including the Psychology Today blog. She's written the book Feminism's New Age, which explores the relationship between feminism, whiteness, and New Age culture. This book was a 2011 finalist for the Forward Book of the Year Award in Women's Issues. She's been involved in the field of women's and gender studies for 30 years, including playing leadership roles in the flagship organization, National Women's Studies Association. And her current project is called Better Metal, Smarter Social Justice, which is about co-opting the best of entrepreneurship and startup culture for progressive ends. As the founding director of the Cassandra Voss Center, Karlyn launched an intersectional gender and identity center that has garnered national attention, and this is, in part, the focus of our conversation today. Welcome, Karlyn.
Thank you so much, Liz.
So glad that you could be with us today. I'm so interested in the work that you're doing with the Cassandra Voss Center, the work of bringing progressive projects to a campus that, on the face of it, seems conservative, a Catholic institution. And I understand that you're bridging the conservative or religious with the progressive, and I would love to hear more about that. How are you doing that?
I would love to tell you. To understand the Cassandra Voss Center, you need to start by understanding Cassandra herself. Cassandra Voss was going to be the first women's and gender studies major at St. Norbert College in 2008, and she died in a car accident in 2007. Actually, it was today, May 21st. It's her death anniversary today. You know, people have lots of stereotypes about feminists, man-hating, or in a homophobic way, lesbian and angry. There are lots of reasons to be angry. She was particularly jubilant, warm, and vibrant. She brought people together. She argued for men to work in the Women's Center on the campus at that time. She brought the vagina monologues to a Catholic campus. And she was really close to her father. And they used to have these really heated discussions that she would talk to me about in office hours over breakfast at a little Greasy Spoon in De Pere, Wisconsin, which is right near Green Bay, Wisconsin, mostly known for its football team. They would meet weekly and have challenging discussions. And she would say, "Dad, you need to understand transgender identity." And he would say, as a conservative Fox News watching guy, "What is that? And what are you talking about?" I mean, this was 10 years ago. Many more people know lots about transgender identity now. And they would have debates. They didn't always agree, but they loved one another through those disagreements. That relationship is the foundation of the center. And so when she died, on her MySpace page, which existed then, one of her life goals was to make her dad a hardcore feminist. And he took that goal very seriously and decided to build what he called, and several people have been in the center and agreed, the most beautiful gender center in the country. It took him 7 years to raise nearly $3 million and to transform a former Protestant church on a Catholic campus into this beautiful, open, modern, and yet historic, welcoming place. I, as the founding director, had the great privilege of imagining what could a center look like if you started from scratch. And starting from scratch is a beautiful place to begin. I can tell you more about that, but we have core values and a mission to transform the thinking. It's called transformative thinking for a just world. And one of our core values is to be welcoming to all people in the space as they are. You know, historically, women's centers haven't always done that.
There is a very moving video on the website of the Cassandra Voss Center that describes the relationship of Cassandra with her father and her father's awakening. I just wanted to make mention of that. It's a very beautiful tribute to her.
Thank you. And people can go to www.snc.edu/CVC and see the video and see our work. Because they were so different, father and daughter, we wanted to bring, in terms of programming, differing voices together. So you asked, how do you do progressive work on a conservative campus? And I think one of the ways you do it is you surprise people and defy stereotypes. I joke that people have lots of stereotypes about feminism or progressive causes, and we live in a historical moment in the United States where divisions are so deep and entrenched. What does it look like when we can cross the aisle or the divide? It's so rare. There's a Saturday Night Live skit where people are gathered around the Thanksgiving table and they can't speak to one another and they keep playing an Adele song, which is the only thing that brings people together, and they stop screaming at one another. And I know people who no longer see their relatives at holidays because they're so divided politically.
Yes.
And so because Kurt and Cassandra loved one another, what would it look like if love is the foundation and the starting point? And we also, with a gender center, an intersectional identity center, really focused on what would it mean to decenter whiteness,
right,
and to have people reckon honestly with their identities. And that combination of both being welcoming and challenging together is a magical combination.
The foundation of the center is really about bridging, founded in loving relationships. And that's a powerful way to talk across differences, to start from love with the intention to meet each other, to share something different, something outside of the normal conversation. And you're kind of outside of the normal conversation in a way. You're a white woman, the director of a program on essentially a white campus, bringing this intersectional analysis, bringing the intention to decenter whiteness. So yes, please talk about that. How do you do that in love with the intention to bridge?
That is such a great question. So George Yancey, who's a really important philosopher, has written a book called Dear White America. He quoted James Baldwin recently, who said, "Love takes off the masks that we fear we cannot live without and know we cannot live within." I've been thinking about that quotation a lot because Bell Hooks, we are a sister center to the Bell Hooks Institute in Berea, Kentucky. She's a major feminist scholar. She also talks about the foundation of social justice as love. And so I think part of it starts, for me, having been in women's and gender studies since I was 19, my understanding of the field of that, it's always been intersectional, which is that a woman of color consciousness is at the center, and that multiple identities are how we understand liberation. You can't have a single identity liberation because, as Audre Lorde says, Black lesbian feminists, right? None of us are single issue or single identity people. It's not how we live our lives. Because I was trained in understanding that, and I also understand white people's fears because I'm white. And I remember being in an Intro to Women's Studies class at Earlham College, a Quaker college, and reading things by Audre Lorde or Pat Parker or any other number of people and feeling like this experience is not my experience. And sometimes I would be afraid. And sometimes I would feel, if I could sit with the fear, liberated because a truth was being told to me that had been hidden from me. Minnie Bruce Pratt, who's a Southern writer, and my family's all from the South, talks a lot about that she saw Birmingham, Alabama anew once she came out as a lesbian and thought about her own racial consciousness. So my own racial consciousness has shifted over the course of my life. And so, for instance, one of the things that we've done, when you think about how Pema Chodron, the Buddhist teacher, says to meet people where they are, our first year was the year of bell hooks. Programming and social justice, consciousness raising is centered, or I think of it as pedagogical, right? How do we teach and delight people? And our core values are that we're scholarship-driven. We think about the best in the field of gender and identity studies. We're welcoming. We welcome all people as they are around the table and into the conversation. We are innovative. We try to do things that are out of the box and surprising, and we're fun. We believe that delight resists tyranny. And so Bell Hooks became the first speaker because she is what I call a Swiss Army knife, a social justice Swiss Army knife. She has written children's books. She has been a preacher and writes on spirituality, is a practicing Buddhist and a Christian. And I knew that she could speak in broad ways to people. We also did a second year on Who's Your Hero and did comic artists. Part of how you move people in Decenter Whiteness is we found a vehicle. When you think about superheroes, a really popular genre. It's become even more popular since we first did it in 2014. So we would have Jean Lewin Yang, who is a MacArthur Genius Award winner, a Library of Congress young adult author, and rewrote the first Asian American comic on the Green Lantern and did a lecture, a Skype lecture, on how we understand Asian superheroes. And so we had a very loyal group of young white men in particular, ages 18 to 22, who showed up at every program for an entire year because they cared about superheroes. That was their way in. And so that's what we really think about, is start where you are. And then sitting in that room, they heard about blackness in superheroes, queerness in the Fantastic Four, the first Asian American superheroes. And so they learned things that they never would have discovered, but they came because they cared about superheroes.
Right.
And that's part of the magic of our programming, is we find what moves people and makes them want to be in the conversation.
An interest, a hobby, a love, a fan base, like comics have all of that. So that's a great way to bring people in. Bell Hooks, too. She is someone who can speak to everybody because she really believes feminism is for everybody, and so has a way of reaching people. I just wanted to hear you talk a little bit more about this idea of woman of color consciousness. If I'm hearing you correctly, the woman of color consciousness is not something that depends on your skin color. It's not an identity based on a visible marker, but it's about consciousness, and that seems important for us to understand. It's really important that it's a both-and mindset. It is true on the one hand that I can read, theorize, and build a center from woman of color consciousness. And yet as a white woman, I also don't experience what it's like to live daily as a woman of color in Green Bay. Many black men I know talk about being confused for being a football player in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and the kind of racist and white supremacist treatment that they've experienced here. So both things are true. I have a limited perspective as a white woman, and yet I can also, out of my own ever-evolving, consciousness raising is ever-evolving, I undo my own learned white supremacy. When we talk about Bell Hooks, one thing that's important to know about our relationship to her, because she's been back every year, she is a woman, like many women of color, whose work and legacy has not been appreciated enough in her own lifetime. So as a center with some resources, I very intentionally
had photographs of her, posters of her, videotaped conversations in a high-quality way, I could use my privilege for good as a white woman. It could help preserve her legacy as a woman of color. She will not die in obscurity with 40 books to her name. Everybody knows who Bell Hooks is. People at one time knew who Zora Neale Hurston was, and then she died in obscurity. And so part of the question with woman of color consciousness, if you're not a woman of color, is how do you decenter your own identity but also support and center women of color?
I would think that your own scholarship in whiteness and cultural appropriation informs your ability to be this kind of director. I'm interested to know how programming is received on your essentially conservative campus.
But on our campus, I would say it's mixed. So when we first invited Bell Hooks, the knowledge of her and her work was so limited. Part of the campaign was to share her work with a campus that might not be friendly to it. So one thing we did is we had a very supportive college president, and we asked him to put on pajamas and a robe and do a cookies and milk reading of her kids' books and her other work and invite everybody in for a night. We've also invited, for instance, in our Year on Masculinity, Laurel Ryder, who created this beautiful set of dolls called Wonder Crew for boys. Because boys, her son came home from school and was told on the playground not to cry, which is something my own daughter has heard on the playground for boys. And she said, I'm going to, as a therapist, create a doll for boys. And we were the Midwest launch of that doll 2 years ago. You can now buy him at Target, just $1 a year. Because when thinking about masculinity, people are afraid to talk about it. And we're at an epidemic in terms of both police brutality and gun violence. And most of that gun violence and police brutality is perpetrated by men. Jackson Katz talks about how we degender those moments of violence and don't talk about them. And I argue, and many scholars argue, Michael Kimmel, Michael Kaufman, Harry Brode, that violence begins in childhood. If people are intimidated, once again, how do we find a way in? And sometimes, like when we invited George Yancey and talk about fear of black bodies and the problem of whiteness, we have a range of emotional responses in the room, and you have to be able to process through those responses and be ready and prepared for some people's deep anger. It's scary to think you might be losing something, and I understand that white people are often afraid. Witness the recent news story of a white woman who called the police on black people having a barbecue and using a barbecue grill rather than a gas grill in a park. And a lot has been made of her making that phone call, because what does it mean when white people act out of fear rather than act out of love? So we try to build programming that addresses that fear, sometimes confronts that fear, but also helps people find a way to come in despite being afraid.
If you're just tuning in, you're listening to Karlyn Crowley, director of the Cassandra Voss Center, talking about spiritual principle and radical hospitality and social justice. So some of those projects that you've done, it's a very non-confrontational way of bringing in intersectionality. People can still be afraid, but they're not necessarily receiving it as a confrontation. What you're saying about responding to people's anger then also asks for you and the center to be very grounded in what you know to be true, because that's what makes those dialogues so difficult and volatile, is when everyone gets afraid, when there's not a stable grounds for that conversation to happen. But that sounds like what you're able to do there.
Well, when everyone's afraid, there's nowhere to move. Bell Hooks says everybody should have at least one friend who is radically different from them. And I take that to heart. In fact, Kurt Voss, the father of Cassandra, is one of my friends. He and I still think very differently, and we continue to find common ground. We're really driven by core values, and I'm interested, and I'm writing a book on how to make social justice smarter and more holistic in an era where everybody is underfunded and exhausted and afraid. Year 3, we did Delight in the Fight. We were really interested in who resists and laughs and survives in the face of injustice, models of gumption, resilience. We wanted to feature the work of Kira Gaunt, who's this beautiful book on how black girls' songs and double Dutch games are the genealogy of hip-hop, really, a different girls' genealogy as opposed to a masculine genealogy. We brought in a double Dutch team from Milwaukee, and everybody came and learned jump rope games. And Kira Gaunt also gave a lecture on girl hip-hop culture. We had a DJ Amy Ongiri from Lawrence University. She DJs and she's a professor, and created a soundtrack because we're interested in holistic pedagogy. What people hear is also part of an embodied liberation. And so she created a Black Girls soundtrack for the day. We really like to think of the whole person. Mind, body, spirit, all your senses, how are they brought into the work of liberation?
You mentioned this doctor. Say her name again.
Dr. Amy Ongiri, who's a professor of film studies at Lawrence University, and she's also a DJ Afrikid. And we like to think of our major lectures, we like to think of them as rock concerts. And so she's been our resident DJ and creates soundtracks. You can follow her on SoundCloud that are about Black women's experience in music. That's just another way that we teach people. We are a center that educates, and how do we educate the whole person is the question. Universities have often been spaces of mind-body dualism. When you create a new center that's intersectional as its floor and not the ceiling, also holistic, also built on love, you have to educate the whole person. You can't just educate the mind.
Expanding consciousness is an embodied practice, and you're really taking that on with addressing all the aspects of a person. That is not just thoughts and ideas and concepts, but also experiential. This is a campus that's based on, as you've mentioned, core values, which presumably come from spiritual teaching or spiritual principle. I'd like to hear more about that, the way that perhaps the spiritual foundation actually enables the work that you do.
In the last election, we had a number of students, like campuses all across the United States, who were in some distress. We are a Catholic Norbertine campus. We're the only Norbertine campus in the world. The Norbertines are a Catholic order who also believe in radical hospitality. And I sometimes joke that the Cassandra Voss Center helps to put the radical back in hospitality. Mm-hmm. The Norbertines themselves believe that all should be welcome as a matter of hospitality on a campus. Also, that the human dignity is a Catholic value. The human dignity of all life is valued. And so we think of human dignity also as training and liberation. So if you're able to really interrogate your own white supremacy or your homophobia, your ableism, you can get to a place of seeing someone's humanity. And then we see each other's mutual humanity. And I really believe that spiritual and religious places, while leftist and progressive people are often very wary of them, it can also liberate. I travel a lot and consult at various campuses around the country. And secular campuses are often deep in cultural wars and identity politics wars with no recourse to seeing one another's human dignity. What Quakers call the inner light, which is why they are pacifists, that you can't kill someone because you will kill the inner light, and then that's not yours to take, which is the underlying belief of pacifism, and Quakers are part of a historic peace church. Secular campuses struggle to find a common dignity that they can have recourse to when people are so divided in this fractious historical moment.
You're talking about spiritual principle and that foundation offering you, enabling you to do progressive work because it's something shared amongst you, or a shared set of principles, universal principles. Is that something you think could be part of secular campuses, not necessarily in a religious basis, but another way to bring in universal principles that enable that kind of shared hospitality?
I think we're at a turning point. Postmodernism as a movement or set of beliefs in the modern university has meant that we've really interrogated, and I would argue that women's and gender studies scholars actually knew this, that your identity shapes your vantage point and your belief. At the same time, postmodernism has said that we can have no recourse to a common humanity because we're all built of these various identities and histories, which means we can have no common ground or connection between us. I think we have to, and I think that this is where a Black woman's and a woman of color genealogy relies on finding common humanity that's liberated and that can see connections among people, even as we're different. So I think we are on the cusp of having to reclaim that in order for us to do really important political work that is freeing.
Well, as you mentioned when we started, we're in a profoundly polarized moment, and we're all suffering for it. We're in a precarious place in terms of reaching across boundaries or building bridges. There seems some urgency to come to a place where we find ways to talk across what seems like intractable differences.
I have a colleague at work who, during George Bush's presidency, he began his morning prayer meditating and saying a prayer for the president. And he did it for a year because his heart filled with hate and he wanted to shift. Did it help? He said yes. He said, yes, I still disagree with him, but I no longer hate him. That's part of so many traditions of loving kindness meditation. You can find some way in to take this thing that is so hard and hateful and massage it or tenderly approach it, look at it, try to transform it. It's really uncomfortable. How do we cultivate the voice of the other?
Part of what you're saying, the opening that we're seeking is really in our own hearts, and our ability to connect is partly what we're seeking when we're talking social justice.
I've been in women's and gender studies my whole career. And part of why, when I had the chance to create the core values of a new center, funding was so important because it's very easy when you're awake to mostly feel anger because there is so much to feel angry at. I spent a lot of my life being angry. And I knew, in the spirit of Cassandra, that I couldn't just be angry. Joy and delight has to be an essential element of how we free ourselves and also to think about this notion of radical self-care, which Audre Lorde talks about. Self-love, self-care, of course they can be commodified, and of course they can be superficial, and they have to be built on deep and radical inclusion. Those are the ways that we move forward.
I so appreciate your time today. We are coming to the end of our conversation. Thank you so much, Karlyn, for sharing the Cassandra Voss Center with us and the thinking that you're doing around intersectionality and decentering whiteness. I think it's a very hopeful, very inspirational place that you're describing.
Thank you so much, Liz.
Find out more about the Cassandra Voss Center and Karlyn's work there at www.snc.edu/CVC. You've been listening to A Spiritual Guide to Politics here on KPFK Radio. My name is Liz Philippos. Thank you so much for listening. I'm so glad you joined us. Until next time.